Hello. Good to see you all. Lots of familiar faces, lots of new faces, which is always healthy. I grew up in the Midwest, in Iowa in particular. And the Iowa that I grew up in, I'm not sure it's the same now, but at that time, people valued honesty, they valued friendship, they were hardworking, they valued being part of something work-wise, they valued their churches and their church community, family. They valued family. It was the kind of time where you could do a handshake for agreement. You didn't have to get anything down on paper. My dad was in sales. He traveled to visit a lot of banks. And he would come back he'd often be gone for the week. He'd come back on Friday night. Oh, I went to such and such. Those people are salt of the earth. We don't hear that very often anymore, do we? Salt of the earth. What does it mean? I think for us, at least at that time, it meant they were stable citizens, model citizens, right? The kind of person you wanted as your neighbor. The term comes from Jesus, comes out of the Bible. You are the salt of the earth. And it was given in the Sermon on the Mount, which was a sermon that was, it's for all of us, but it was particularly intended for the disciples. The disciples had a big job ahead of them, right? If we just kind of touch into the history, we're at a time in the development of human beings where we're making a transition from being hunter-gatherers to living in community. And so the Jewish faith was perfect for the time because consciousness needs to evolve and consciousness needs structure. I mean, even we talked today how important it is to have your spiritual practice, right? To begin to give structure to your development as a spiritual being. And so at that time, there was lots of rules so that you could come together in community in a safe and healthy environment, an environment you could come to trust. But then Jesus comes along, and Jesus gets this very clear message that humanity is ready for another big leap in development. That instead of needing rules and rulers, that there is a spirit within. And that spirit will inform you. It guides you. It is a loving spirit. It is about compassion and love, but not just that. There's clarity in the spirit. There's strength and power. There's value. It's creative. It's new. It's fresh. The world will evolve in beautiful ways, and you uniquely will contribute to that. Have you ever tried to change the direction of a culture, of a people? Just become a minister. What happens is that there's resistance. So if you're trying to gear up 12 guys to change thousands of people, are you going to say, be a model citizen? I don't think so. It falls kind of short. I think what Jesus was saying, we're going to explore it today, is follow the Christ within. Follow your true nature. And we're going to understand why. We'll start right out with, what is salt? Salt is a powerful spice where a little goes a long way, right? And what does it do when you add salt to your food? It enhances the flavor. It brings often the flavor out with greater depth. It brings enjoyment. Each of us is an expression of spirit. a unique expression. And we have amazing power as spiritual beings. The very mystery of the universe comes through each of us. And that mystery is not limited by the world around us. It is the way through and the way around. It's amazing what happens as we turn within for our guidance, for our strength. I don't like to use really famous people as illustrations, but I was just reading about Mother Teresa, and I loved what I read. So she felt called into ministry, into being a nun, in her teenage years. And most of her family was supportive, but not her older brother. Her older brother's words, if I read it correctly, was, you'll be smashed? Buried. You'll be buried. Thank you. See, Anne read it too. You'll be buried. Now, there's no explanation of that given, but when you're the minister, you get to kind of fill in the blanks. And what occurred to me as I read that was, can you imagine having a little sister who has got some spunk to her, who you can see has capacities and abilities, saying that she is now going to go in to the Catholic Church, which is totally male-dominated. It's changed so much, hasn't it? And while the nuns have influence and they do a very important work, ultimately it is the men that determine what they can and can't do. And so he's concerned for his sister. But when you are in touch with who you are as a spiritual being, nothing can stand in your way. And that's exactly what happens to Mother Teresa, right? Do you know her first assignment was in Calcutta, and that's where she spent her life. And her first assignment, I don't know, again, it's hard to get all the information, but she is basically given an old abandoned warehouse, and she's going to teach out of it. No desk, no chairs, it's just an empty warehouse. She's so creative that she just writes the lessons out on the dirt floor. And it goes from there. At her death, they were in operation. Who knows what didn't make it to her death, but at her death, there were 80, and they used the word well-equipped schools, didn't have to write on the dirt floor, 300 clinics, 70 leprosy clinics, 30 homes for the dying, 30 homes for abandoned children, 40,000 volunteers worldwide. She was not buried. A little salt goes a long way. Who you are as a spiritual being is powerful beyond your imagination and will take you places you never imagined. In those days, salt was used as a preservative. And when you read the narratives on the Bible, the narratives touch into the fact that what's needing to be preserved? The truth. You see, when things are going on in the world, and there's always things going on in the world and in our lives, it's easy to get pulled out into them and to begin to live in conformity with what's going on and lose track of the truth. And that truth can be our personal truth. It can be a greater truth in the moment. But it is what guides us and inspires us. And it's what brings about positive change in the world. So when we turn within, we have a greater opportunity to connect with what's our truth? What's mine right now to do or to say or not to do and not to say? This next one, you're just going to have to ride along with me. They talked about the fact that they use salt to fertilize the soil. I don't recommend it. I think we would go counter to that, although someone at lunch who was more of a chemist than me said, well, And I'm like, okay, maybe. But as I read about it, and there's not much said about it except in the commentaries, but as I read about it, they talked about how they would use a little bit of salt with animal waste, and that was their main fertilizer. So I don't know what salt does to animal waste, but we're just going to roll with it. Because you see, fertilizer, it's what? It sustains the soil. It nourishes the soil. It allows for us to be fed, to be renewed, to be nourished. And that's what Spirit does for us too. Life has a way of just hammering at us. Not all the time, but sometimes it feels like when it's hammering that it's never going to stop hammering, right? One thing that's interesting about Spirit is self-renewing in you. Have you noticed that? You never have to lay down for a nap for Spirit. You lay down for a nap for your body, your humanness. Spirit only gives, never takes. You've maybe had the experience of, walking into a meeting, or many times I've walked in for a meeting with my teacher and I feel exhausted and how am I ever going to get through it? And then we touch on something real, something true. Maybe in that meeting, someone's vulnerable and it speaks to your heart. It awakens the Spirit in you. And the next thing you know, you're wide awake and ready to go. And where did that tiredness go? Because Spirit is life-giving. In fact, when Spirit leaves our body, the body's dead. It is the very nature of life. It's dynamically alive. It's fresh. It's new. It doesn't rehash anything. It's always about responding to the moment in fresh and appropriate and new ways. Did any of you happen to catch the story on Rose Jerome this week? This is a woman, now as I tell you the details, you'll probably start nodding. She died this week at 113. She's considered to be the longest living, in length of years, Holocaust survivor. And as you read about her story, it's so inspiring. This is a woman that was hammered at by life. She never had to live in a concentration camp, but soon after she was married, she was pregnant. Her husband and his father, her father-in-law, were put into a concentration camp, arrested. About a year later, he signed over his company, which was a big company in Germany, and virtually all his wealth to the Nazi Party for freedom. And he and his family were allowed to free. Rose, her husband, and their daughter were able to get a visa to Shanghai. And they thought they were finally free, right? Well, Shanghai was a Japanese territory at that time. And when World War I broke out, they put all the Jews into a ghetto. And Rose and her husband and their daughter were given an unfinished bathroom to live in for 7 years. They were confined to this ghetto. Luckily for them, her mother and sister had made their way to the United States and sent them tickets, some kind of passage to get out. Rose had scraped together $80 over the time, and they left for America with $80. There, she and her husband decide that they should divorce. And she has to support her daughter on her own. She takes up knitting, and she knits for people. And they moved from one-room dwelling to another. They never really had their own apartment. They were always furnished. They never had their own furniture. And then a Jewish merchant taught her how to start a knitting business where she started shops that offered knitting supplies and brought people together to knit. And for the first time since they left Germany, she had an apartment of her own with her daughter. The thing that inspired me is when people were asked, "What do you remember about Rose?" They said, time and time again, she said, "Aren't we blessed?" You see, the Spirit in you is not limited by what's going on around you. The Spirit in you is self-nourishing. It renews you. It strengthens you. It's what allows us to get through times where we tend, when we're caught up in the ego, when we get identified with the ego, where we feel helpless, where we feel, well, I live in Grand Lake now, and I've been amazed at how many people have said to me, "I'm not sleeping well at night, I feel depressed." This is being caught in an outer world orientation. Now, I'm not saying bury your head. I'm saying far from that. I'm saying that the renewing of our aliveness is something that comes from within. It is the salt of the earth, of which, remember, you are its expression. So you can understand why that seems much more inspiring to me than, "Hey, go out and be a model citizen." That's kind of following the rules, isn't it? And really, what Spirit's inviting you to do is only follow the rule of love. Love and compassion, which sometimes doesn't look so loving and compassion, right? Like when we have a friend that's an alcoholic and we have to do an intervention, they're not going to think we're being very loving. But we are. We're bringing back depth to life. I think we could bring up the scripture now, Tom. This is the actual scripture. You'll see in a moment why I didn't lead with it, because it's kind of confusing. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. Luckily, the narratives say something about this, because I was like, I'm not going to use the whole scripture. It turns out that the salt that we get to eat today is highly refined and purified, not in a bad way, it's pure. But in the days of Jesus, almost 2,000 years ago, salt was mined and there was no way to purify it, so it had lots of contaminants, lots of other minerals and stuff in it. Sometimes those minerals would interact with the salt and it actually could lose its saltiness. And when it lost its saltiness, oh, can you leave it up, Tom? I'm sorry, should have made that clear. When it loses its saltiness, then, you couldn't get the saltiness back. Thank God that's not the way it is with Spirit, right? It's true. We see all sorts of people in the world around us living purely from ego. Remember, ego edges God out. Ego is an assurance that we are separate. Ego is an assurance that we need to protect ourselves, to play it safe, to go along. I love that you guys sung about we are not afraid, but ego is afraid. Ego tends to cave in, bring up lots of anxiety in us. And what Jesus, I think, is saying here is if you're going to live from that, you're really not bringing any contribution of good to the world, no lasting contribution of good. Oh, it can look like you are, but when you lay down to die, there could be a lot of regret. Didn't really do what my heart called me to do. And so while that salt that was contaminated with other minerals and maybe dirt and stuff cannot regain its saltiness, the beauty is you just take a couple of deep breaths and you're on your way back to the depth of what you are. A beautiful, salty, spiritual being. I've said so many times, my God, how can the world get any more challenging than it is today? And it does. Really, it does. I mean, we're seeing it all over the place. Wars that have gone on much longer than we thought. Genocide. We've got chaos in this country. One of the beautiful things, though, about the world doing what the world does is it invites us to move to greater depth, the depth within. And what you find as you continue to do your spiritual practice is that all of this disruption is at the surface. And as you move deeper and deeper into your nature as a spiritual being, into your very soul, it's still and quiet and peaceful. There's lots of space for the guidance that's needed for you particularly, your individual guidance. So maybe you're not going to go out and be, quote, a Mother Teresa at the big scale of things, but in your own life, you will have impact, loving impact, strong impact, generous impact, kind impact, informed, perfectly attuned impact. And it comes so naturally, it's like a flow. When instead that we just live from our ego, we don't have that impact. And so it seemed, I know for me, I'm not one of those people that puts up affirmations. I don't want to be caught in my head. But on my bathroom mirror it says, you are the salt of the earth. And maybe all be reminded that we are the salt of the earth, and to know that you can't just walk out of here and just magically be the salt of the earth. We need to be committed to our spiritual practice. We need to develop that capacity to come back to the quiet when the world really comes hammering down on us. When we do, the next scripture is about you are the light of the world. Just by walking around as the salt that you are, you'll impact the world. God bless you.